there is a certain level of audacity you have to have, because to be a writer, you're not just saying, I'm processing my thoughts. This is cathartic. This is for me. No, as a writer, you're saying this is for other people. This is for public consumption. And there is a level of audacity there. But I think along with audacity is the humility not to take yourself too seriously. So you need the boldness to put your words out there. And then you need the humility for some people to be like, I hate that. That sucks.
What do a book editor, a pastor, and a writing coach all have in common? In today's episode, we're joined by Will Parker Anderson, a man who embodies all three. As a senior editor at Waterbrook and Multnomah, an imprint of Penguin Random House, Will has helped shape powerful, Christ-centered messages into books that reach and inspire. He's also the founder of the Writer's Circle, a growing community and podcast that equips nonfiction writers to sharpen their craft and publish with purpose. With a passion for the gospel and a deep understanding of story, Will walks alongside authors to ensure their words glorify Christ and connect meaningfully with readers. In this conversation, we explore his unique leadership journey, one that spans publishing, pastoring, and platform building, and the wisdom he's gained helping others tell their story well. Will, welcome to Seek, Go, Create.
Thanks, Tim. Great to be here. Excited to talk with you.
Excited that you're here too, man. I'm really excited about this. I've cranked out a number of episodes this week, kind of batching.
Yeah.
And you're kind of like my exclamation point.
I'm honored.
We're recording this on we're recording this on a Friday, and this is kind of sort of for the listener, but it's a little bit for me personally on some stuff I'm working on. So
perfect.
So we're gonna have fun, Will. Before we get into that, though, would you rather answer the question, what do you do? You know, kind of typical networking thing.
Yeah.
Or who are you? Pick it and just start answering.
Yeah, love that question. It's a tough one, too. So I actually transitioned from being a full-time pastor for over 10 years to being a book editor. And that transition brought this question to the fore in my life, because suddenly what I had been doing, pastoring, and what I thought I would do forever shifted. And so I'm going to go with, in this season, who I am is probably more important. And I would answer that a number of ways. I'm a son of God. I am a father, a husband, a creative, a writer. And yes, some of those things involve what I do from day to day. But those are simple identities. You don't go to your point, networking events and say, yeah, I'm a dad and a husband. You talk about your accolades or your resume or whatnot. And I think God has been pruning me of my attachment to titles a little bit, and in a good way, showing me that who I am is important. My calling generally to serve others, to love him, can be applied in all kinds of vocations and projects and businesses. And they may change through the years, but what won't change is my status in his eyes. And so that's how I'd answer.
Very good. All right. So this is I'm just going to go ahead and go big with like my follow-up question.
Yeah.
Do you believe that at this time you are walking in those steps that God created you to walk in, or are you moving towards that, or are you transitioning? I mean, there's a lot of words we could use here. Which resonates more with you when I mention that?
Yeah, I believe that God's will is more mysterious than we would like to imagine. And sometimes No,
Will, we want simple answers, and that's all we're going to answer here on Seek, Go, Create. No,
I'm sorry, I'm an editor. I like to complicate people's lives. That's part of my MO. But God, in his wisdom, not only knows where we need to be and what we need to do, but he knows how much information we need or don't need. And so I think sometimes we play the God card and we say, yeah, this is what he has. And I was saying that in some seasons of my life. I'm going to be a church planter and a pastor. That is my calling. And there's almost an accolade you receive when you know your lane and you always walk in it. And to some, God calls them into something early on and they stick with it for their whole life. And God bless that. But for me, it's just been much more mysterious. And so what I like to focus on are the things that are clear, what God has made plain. And that is to be as present as I can be with what's actually in my hands, my relationship with my kids, again, as a husband, extending beyond that, my church community, even my city, my neighbors. Those are the things that I know that I'm called to. And I have a ton of fun vocationally. I mean, I love what I do. I love building things. I love editing, good writing and meeting interesting people. I've just learned that God knows, where I need to be in any given season of life. And editing has been, in retrospect, just a surprising delight. Like, oh, wow, I didn't see this coming, but now that I'm here, Lord, I can see your wisdom. And now that I've walked through some of that pain of letting go of some previous dreams or goals, I'm recognizing like, oh, wow, this is far more suited for me than all those things I thought I wanted. And now that I'm here, I'm learning to be increasingly grateful. So
I do love that response. And what I'm doing is I'm circling around the question that I'm getting to about your role in full-time ministry and sort of transitioning. And so the follow-up I've got is, have you always had that, what I will call, this is me kind of summarizing what I just heard you say, kind of a peaceful, relaxed approach to this journey? I use the word journey a lot here. So go create this journey you're on. Or was there a time that you were a bit more intense, dogmatic? I could throw a lot of words out here about your, I'm doing air quotes for those listening in, those watching on YouTube, your calling. And I want to preface it with this too. I've been around church world for a while, but I'm a business guy. So I was saved in business world.
yeah.
And so church has always been a little bit, I kind of poke fun at it. Truthfully, I'm sorry.
Oh, you're in
I
good
ask
company.
for forgiveness often.
Yeah.
But I also spent a couple years at a Bible school and this whole thing around calling. And I was called at the age of 3 to whatever.
Yeah.
Anyway, has Will always been that relaxed that I just heard you say, or was there a time where you were like, man, this is where I'm headed?
Yeah. I would describe myself as a fool in the hands of a wise God. So yeah, when I look at the big milestones of life, the full weight of decisions didn't really land on me. That could be just part of my temperament, a bit more laid back and intuitive in how I move through the world versus planned, type A. But from choosing the college I attended, which required moving states, to marrying my wife, to different cities we've lived in, to jobs I've taken, of course, there's moments of stress, moments of wondering, okay, Lord, how are you going to come through here, or which direction should we go? But the overarching theme of my life has been really just a willingness to allow God's Spirit to blow us in whatever direction. And that doesn't mean we don't have goals and boundaries and thoughtful discernment, welcoming the opinions of mentors and thinking through things. But ultimately, what's happened in the pattern I've noticed is whenever something just clicks and is effortless and a door opens, not every time, but most of the time, that's an indication. And a lot of times, every other door will just close, and then this one door will open. And whereas I was beating my head against the wall trying to make something else happen, then something I didn't even see coming, pops up, and God blesses it. And I've learned to just trust that. And I have enough reps now of seeing God's faithfulness that I've learned to recognize it. And of course, he's not bound to any pattern. He can act in our life however he wants. But I think in his kindness, he gives us some nudges like, remember when I did that and that and that before? Well, I'm doing that again. And so you can pry your hands off the controls and just trust and fully lean into this opportunity. And I would say that's how I've approached most decisions. And a quick side story, I used to teach high school seniors theology, and they would get so anxious about their college choice in the next season. And I would just tell them the story of how I chose my college. I was like, guys, I applied to a bunch of colleges, got accepted to some of them, didn't make a decision, didn't even really think much about it. Then my parents sat me down one day and said, Will, you've got to make a choice. So pick a college. So I just picked one, and I picked one in California because I thought it'd be fun to live there. That was as shallow as my decision making was, and yet God has done extensive work in my life in the last 20 plus years here in the state of California. The friends I've met, I met my wife here, on and on. The ministries I've been a part of, he knew even when I was clueless. So I hope that would be an encouragement to people listening.
I think it is. And one thing I heard you say earlier, I think I wrote down, allow God to make decisions. But I mean, I just was thinking you really are allowing God to be God, and us saying we're not God. One of the things I recognize is I have a high degree of need for control. I think a lot of people do. They want to control their situation, their lives, probably their spouse, their children, blah, 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 all that stuff. And I think part of the journey of people that are like that, and I think there are many people like that in first world cultures, is being bent, broken, whatever you want to call it, to realize that we are not God and that there is a bigger picture beyond us. So somewhere along the way, you got into ministry, and then you have stepped away from full-time ministry. And my observation is that a lot of people, once they get into the ministry, they will often feel as if that is the pinnacle of what they could be doing for God, with God, kingdom of God, church world, whatever you want to call them. I'm always fascinated by when people transition away from, and I don't think people are out of ministry, but how a lot of people define full-time ministry. Tell me more about transitioning. Maybe you could give a little bit of the background of your full-time ministry experience, and then maybe stepping away from it.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I was a pastor in various contexts for 10, 12 years, somewhere in there, and did all kinds of things. I was a youth pastor. I was a local outreach pastor, an associate pastor. I helped plant 2 different churches here in Orange County and loved it. Went through seminary, and, some people have a dry seminary experience where they feel like God becomes a subject and their faith sort of atrophies. I had the opposite, thanks to some really dynamic, raw, authentic type professors who just sort of broke the mold of what a stiff academic personality should be. They're just very open about their own sin and struggles, their past. And there was a real gratitude and rawness to their faith that was really transformative for me. And I miss those days, honestly. There was a season where I would just tear up anytime worship began in church, because the words and the person of Jesus had landed on me. And I was a lifelong Christian, right? I'm like 23, 24, 25, and just having this incredible experience. So I love ministry. One of the ways that God has gifted me, I think, is to teach and to communicate. And I always love opening the scriptures, being in a room of people, and getting to share, make things clear, just get people asking good questions. And that's what I really miss about ministry. That, and I think sitting with people, I don't get to do that as much in the same way as pastoring, but the transition happened. So I, for 4 years, was on staff at a church here in Santa Ana, California. We planted in 2020, so right in the middle of the pandemic and everything. And I was a church planting resident there and ended up becoming essentially an associate pastor. And as the residency was winding down, I came to this fork in the road, and I had 2 opportunities before me. And this is what I was referring to with doors opening and closing, right? One was a church in Portland that was potentially looking for a lead pastor for one of their congregations. The other was an editing role where I'm at now at Waterbrook. And I had been doing a lot of freelance writing. You know, as a church planter, you're not making a lot of money. So I would be doing a ton of writing work, writing copy for different organizations. And I did a project with The Chosen, the TV series, writing curriculum for them. And it was sort of a spin-off from the show. They were trying to write curriculum for Gen Z. And so I met another editor there who had just started at Waterbrook and said, hey, well, we're hiring. Would you maybe want to apply? And so anyways, the church planting thing in Portland didn't work out. They weren't quite ready to bring someone on. The timing didn't align. And I had a hard deadline of when my residency ended. So I needed to find work. And the editing job worked out. Again, it felt quite effortless. I was hired by someone I deeply respect who's just a veteran in the publishing industry who saw something in me and honestly took a risk. On paper, I was not the most qualified person, but I kind of slid in laterally into this industry that normally you have to climb up. And I just recognize, here's how I've described it. Editing is the job that I was preparing for my whole life, but I didn't know it. And so as I've stepped into this, I've realized, man, I am so suited for this and what the job requires. And that's not boastful saying I'm so good at it. I'm just saying the type of personality, the work environment, the relational aspect, but then being able to just sit with ideas for hours, like at a computer, you know, do I enjoy that? It's just been very, very rewarding. So that's a little bit of my story.
Is it a ministry for you?
100%. Yep. And, you know, I may be a pastor again someday. I don't know what God has, but I will never leave that role behind. And I want to be careful here because people have different experiences, some of them painful. And so when you talk about leaving ministry, there are all kinds of motivations. I personally love the church. I'm committed to the church. In many ways, I miss, you know, being in the church. And so I think I always try to carry some of that with me. And what I do is highly relational. So as I talk with authors, I'm taking the most precious thing many of them have ever created, which is this book, this manuscript. And I'm walking beside them through the editorial process, which can be painful. You're cutting some ideas and adding others. It's very delicate work in some cases. I am praying for them. You know, we're exchanging voice memos week in and week out. I'm encouraging them. I'm sitting with them in their marketing meetings and trying to champion them and bring ideas to the table to help their book reach more people. Yeah, I think it's very pastoral what I do. Like I just sent an author yesterday. I had read through his manuscript for the first time, made all my edits, and then I type up sort of a summary we call an editorial memo. That's just my high-level feedback. And at the beginning of that, I just copied and pasted this liturgy called A Liturgy for Receiving Feedback. And it just talks about how our identity is in Christ, how our ideas and whether they're received or rejected does not define our worth. And that's just one example of I'm always looking for little opportunities where I can be more than just an editor, but where I can be a friend in some cases. I can be a pastor in some cases. And not to blur the professional lines there, but the reality is, again, this is like precious heart, mind, soul work of these authors. And I'm not coming in as a cold, detached grammar Nazi. You know, I'm coming in as someone who wants to enter into the creative process with the authors I work with and who's really an advocate for them. And what a privilege to get to do some of that supportive work.
Yeah, that's good. Going back, you mentioned you were a youth pastor.
Yeah.
At least I'm familiar with those roles. At least you made so much money in that you never have to think about money again, right?
Yeah.
That's a high paying gig, right?
Oh, the
Make
payment is in pizza and fun events, but not money.
42 cents an hour when you calculate it out or something like that. So no,
Absolutely.
I actually believe that what you're describing is pastoral discipling
Yeah.
because as a coach, I typically have worked with leaders and leadership teams, and I don't think I'm, making more of myself than I should be, but I feel as if I interact with people more in a role of a discipler,
Mm.
be able to disciple people. And it's interesting you bring it up. I've just started a role where I'm functioning as a COO of a company that was a client. And when I talked to the CEO, my good friend, we've known each other for 30 years, we actually, when we were crafting our roles, I said, it's going to be more like you're an evangelist and I'm the pastor in that way. For profit, I mean, it's a business, okay? Don't get me
Yeah.
wrong,
Wow.
but I actually believe that the marketplace is the place where most of this occurs. And again, I think what we will call the
Hmm.
church, traditional church, I think we need to embrace more I don't know, the ways that they can interact together instead of rating them out like we've done. That's me. That's my little rant on that. But
Yeah.
have you? I mean, do you consider yourself a writer? Have you written from a young age, or how have you kind of come into getting your writing chops?
Yeah. Great question. Yes, I've always had a love for writing. Stretching back to kindergarten, actually. It's kind of funny to analyze your elementary year, writing, but there was a assignment in kindergarten where it was an acrostic poem and first letter of, I think it was the word ocean or something. And every kid, it was just random. Each line was just its own thing. Apparently, this is what my parents tell me, my acrostic was all ocean themed. So I wove it all together in my tiny 5-year-old brain. And the truth is, Tim, uh, I love writing. I just know so many fantastic writers that you're tempted to compare yourself, right? But what I had was an environment that nurtured my love for telling stories, for writing, and made me believe that maybe I before I actually was. As an now, I publish mainly articles across, all kinds of different organizations, websites. I have my own newsletter, but I'll look back on something I wrote a year ago and I'll think, wow, I could do so much better. And, your future version of yourself is always going to look back at the version today and be like, yeah, that wasn't that great. And but I love that because it shows growth. And looking back, it's like those tick marks on a door frame as you measure a kid who's growing. And then, you don't see them growing day to day, but you can see when you look back how much you really have grown. And I think as a writer, that's been my mentality. But for me to sit down and write and to wrestle through an idea and to try to get it right and then to ship it out into the world and to see its impact, great or small, to me is one of the most rewarding things in the world. And so for me right now, I mostly do that through Substack and my newsletter, where I have a group of folks that I am writing to, and they're mostly aspiring writers, but I love even writing about writing. So
That's good. At times I think there's a fine line. Maybe it's not that fine. Maybe it's just me between confidence,
yeah,
arrogance, and maybe being delusional, and
yeah,
you brought up that you may have been given more confidence than you really should have had. I think I was raised that way. I wasn't writing at a young age, but I was speaking, and I loved speaking and telling stories,
mm,
which is, I've sort of migrated that. We're going to talk about the relationship between being a writer, author, and storyteller in just a moment, because I want to really unpack that. I think they're related. They're cousins or siblings, but they're
yeah.
different. So how important is confidence. And I want to mention one thing related to being in kindergarten, which I'm guessing is like 5, 6-ish years old.
Yeah.
I showed you right before we hit record, I showed you we're in the alleyway behind my granddaughters, and
Yeah.
there's one, she's 5 years old. And we were having a conversation at dinner yesterday, and we were talking about some activities that she might want to do soon. And we brought up, do you want to take piano lessons? Do you want to take violin? And she just boldly in front of the table said, I already know how to play piano. And we all kind of looked at each other. She's 5 now. There's no one in the family that's owned a piano. She's got a toy piano, but she boldly proclaimed, she might have gotten this from me, by the way. See, I think this is borderline delusional. I think that's where you step into this. She basically said, yeah, I can play piano. We said, well, don't you want lessons or anything? And she almost looked at us like, why would I need lessons?
Yeah, I got this.
I can already play. How important is confidence when it comes to writing? And how do you have to manage that as someone who might have the red pen and are critiquing someone's writing?
Yeah, what a tough question. The word that I like to use is audacity. So I got that from Andrew Peterson. He has a memoir called, it's either Adorning the Dark or God of the Garden, one of those. But I think it's Adorning the Dark because he's talking more about creatives, those, whether they're songwriters, artists, writers. And there is a certain level of audacity you have to have, because to be a writer, you're not just saying, I'm processing my thoughts. This is cathartic. This is for me. No, as a writer, you're saying this is for other people. This is for public consumption. And there is a level of audacity there. But I think along with audacity is the humility not to take yourself too seriously. So you need the boldness to put your words out there. And then you need the humility for some people to be like, I hate that. That sucks. I disagree. And to not have it crush your identity or sense of self-worth. But confidence is a tricky word for me, because what I've discovered, even with writers who, mentioning their names, people would think, oh, they've arrived. They've written best-selling books. Being on the inside of publishing, what I see is that imposter syndrome infects everyone. No one's immune to it. Everyone feels like they're the jokester in the room, that somehow they snuck in, and at any moment, someone's going to tap them on the shoulder and call them out like, you don't belong. And I'm talking people who on paper are successful, you know? I edit a lot of books by well-known authors, and a lot of times I'll think, man, okay writing, you know what I mean? And that's very common in the publishing industry. And so, but what they have is audacity. They have that sense of, first of all, it's a burning within, like, I got to get this out. You got to have that fire and that urgency. But then you have to have the audacity to say, and I'm actually going to act on it. I'm going to plant this flag in the ground in the form of the written word. I'm going to practice in public. You know, I was processing with a good friend of mine. He's published, I think 5 books. But his first one is when he was like 25. And it made a little bit of a splash. You know, he was interviewed by NPR and LA Times and a couple others. And then the book just got ripped apart by 1 or 2 leaders that he deeply respected. And it just stung. So I was talking with him at least a decade later. And I was like, so looking back on that book, how do you feel about it now? You know, do you stand by your words? And he's like, I do, but yeah, there's a lot of things I would say differently. But what's freeing, I think, for writers is, yeah, he would say things differently now in some cases, but he doesn't regret the book. He has learned the pain of being criticized by some of his heroes, and he's still okay. And his books have gotten better and better and better. And because I have access to these databases, I can tell you that his last book sold more than any of his other books, and I would say is the best book he's ever written. So yeah, audacity does not mean you think you're always right. It means you're willing to take risks and put it on the line. And to me, few things are as sad as when there's a capable writer who is so afraid or their humility has grown into insecurity. It's been taken too far. And I'm thinking of one friend in particular who often says, I think it's irresponsible for me to put my words out there to that many people because who am I? I'm like, well, dude, yes, but let me tell you, there's thousands of people much less qualified than you who are already doing that. And so part of me wonders if what's underneath that is a fear of looking stupid, is a fear of, and I'm not questioning his authenticity. I know he really does feel responsible for the impact of his words. But anyways, yeah, I think audacity and humility are the paradox of a writer's mindset.
Yeah, and there's a word ego that popped into my mind that I believe you probably have to you have to critique, I guess we could use that word, while also pastoring and nurturing someone's soul while you're doing it. And I recognized it. I put 70,000 words in a novel, and no one would ever say that Tim, he is just a model of humility. No, they would possibly use some other words to describe me. But I'll tell you, Will, I mean, we self-published, but I was like going, I wasn't sure I wanted to push upload on Amazon and all because it was a bit different. It was a novel. There was a little bit of self-reflection in it. I had never put a lot of words out, even though I'd been writing most of my life. And it was a little bit of a shaky start. I don't think I was excited about possible criticism. Maybe that was what it was.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. But I think about personal preference, and I wonder how that integrates into what you do. And I just thought about this book series, and most of this audience would probably agree that the 50 Shades of Grey books were trash as far as their content. But even worse to me, it was just bad writing. I had someone around me that said they read a portion of it and, I think it was E.L. James or something, made a boatload of money, did well and all that kind of stuff. Truthfully, it was almost porn, if you ask me.
Mm-hmm.
But the writing was horrible. Had it been good writing, I would say, okay, the content's not my thing and all that, but it was horrible. So how does personal preference and just liking versus not liking certain things enter into your role?
Yeah. Are you asking sort of how I evaluate writing or?
Yeah, well, I mean, you mentioned in the earlier, you said this is good writing, or this writing may not be good.
Yeah.
How do you know? Maybe the best way of asking. How do you know if writing is good or not? And this might be me personally asking.
Yeah, great question. And I should qualify, I'm a nonfiction editor, so I can really speak primarily to, that genre. Because fiction writers, to me, I just am filled with envy how gifted they are. I mean, to tell a story and that being all that your book is, it is a story from start to finish. You got to know what you're doing with pacing and dialogue and the way you describe things. But yeah, in the nonfiction world, what makes good writing? There's no way around the subjectivity of it, to be fair, right? So some people are going to love one type of author and they're not going to like another. And the next person is going to feel differently. They might feel the reverse. But in general, I think writing that resonates addresses a felt need, something that readers can readily identify. It names an ache that they feel. And in the best cases, it names an ache that they feel but haven't been able to articulate for themselves. So good writing provides the gift of articulating the groans of our soul, whether it's the fear we feel, the hopes that we have, the dreams that we have, the problems we're facing. And a mistake I think a lot of writers make is their writing is too them focused. They're writing for themselves, not for the readers. And so as an editorial team, we have different ways that we will coach writers, like different comments that we'll make. Here's a few of them. We'll say something like, this is a great place to turn to the reader. In other words, go and ask the reader a question or encourage them to think about something, or if you've just taught some principle or truth, give them a buffet of ways that this could work out in their life, get their juices flowing, that kind of thing. So turn to the reader. But my favorite one is look the reader in the eye, because it's concrete. It's like you're sitting at coffee and there's someone across from you. And you know those moments in conversations where sometimes you're distracted, you're stirring your coffee, maybe you're glancing over at the awkward first date sitting next to you, but then you have moments where you're just making direct eye contact. You're locked in and you're connecting with the person that you're communicating with. And good writing taps into that, even though it's on the page, not in person. It's quite possible to do that. So that's one thing. What else makes for good writing? I would say clarity and pacing are huge. And so a lot of what I help writers do is really boil down what they're trying to say. A good story at the wrong time makes it a bad story. So a lot of times I'll be reading through a manuscript and I'm like, this is hilarious. I love this story, but it doesn't fit. Or, wow, this is a heartbreaking narrative. I think actually you spent too much time here. I think you went into some details that are going to burden readers rather than help them. And not saying writers should airbrush or minimize their pain, but when we get writing, sometimes we get extra cathartic and it's like a therapy session for us. And again, the minute you decide that you want to share your words with others, that the writing is for them, what that means is you have to put them first. And you have to be a ruthless eliminator and editor of your own life stories and sprinkle them in as seasoning, but not the main course. The exceptions, of course, would be a memoir, where that's the whole deal. But those are extremely hard to sell, even harder to write well. And I think a lot of writers intuitively turn to memoir when they're trying to write something, because it's like, oh, I'll just write my story. But actually, what most nonfiction books should be, I think, is books that are teaching you something, solving a problem, that kind of a thing. They're instructive in some way. So I could go on and on, but those are a few things. And I mentioned pacing. That taps into the storytelling aspect. So knowing how long to tell a story is part of it. So is transitioning from the end of that story into whatever point you're making. And you could do that deductively or inductively. Deductively is when you give the truth first and then you explain it through the story. Inductively is where you start with the story, and the climax of the story, almost like one of Jesus's parables, is this pithy takeaway, like the take-home point. So you can do it either way, but knowing how to do that well and knowing, okay, what details will engage the reader and keep them clued in, and then when too many details are going to cause them to tune out, like those instincts are very important when it comes to writing nonfiction.
Yeah, and it's good. I like that you brought up that there is a difference between fiction and nonfiction. One of the hardest things I had to do, I write more what I call fiction with a purpose. I'm attempting to teach and get some points across. So it's kind of like fiction on a mission or something like that is what I call
Pilgrim's
it.
Progress.
But dialogue, something like that. Dialogue. I actually hired a coach to help me with writing dialogue. It was like extremely difficult to do. But do you see a correlation at all between people that are good oral communicators and that they're also good written? Or is there a disconnect? The reason I bring it up, I was in Bible school and there was a lady that said, Tim, you're a pretty good writer and all that. Would you read my book? And this was a person that was sort of awkward communicating in general. And truthfully, the book was a little awkward also. So, and maybe that was just an isolated situation. Do you see correlations with people that are, if they're good communicators, it translates to multiple mediums, written, speaking, or am I trying to make something of nothing?
Yeah, great question. I think it would depend on a few things. So it depends on what you mean by good oral communicator. because there's different skills involved, right? So I'm editing a book right now where I actually think he is a incredible oral communicator, but one of his skills is distilling big ideas in small, catchy, memorable phrases. Um, and when he submitted his manuscript, I was like, wow, I'm seeing that on the page. Like you have, I told him, because I was just debriefing with him, I was like, these phrases are like souvenirs. They're things that, because they're so pithy and so catchy, readers can take them with them and remember them. They may not remember everything you said in the book, but some of these are going to stick with them. That's a communication gift that this guy has. But there's often a huge disconnect between people who are great on stage, in-person communicators, and then they go to write a book and it's all over the place because they're intuitive thinkers. They're not super linear. They don't think as much in terms of structure and order. They're just really good at capturing a room. And you could honestly give them any topic and just be like, go riff on that and make it engaging. And they could do it. And then you have communicators who are sort of the unicorns who can do both. It's like they have this magnetic quality about them. They have an ability to read a room and to win people over effortlessly, in minutes. And they know how to structure. They know how to build a talk to sort of a climactic point. They know how to, as we were saying, really look people in the eye and engage them. So it's not just about here's the truth and the information, but there's a real presence about them and they can see their audience really well. Yeah, those folks, they can pull it off, but often we have to sort of teach some new skills to public speakers as they come to a book. The question is, do you write the way you talk, and should you? Yes and no. Certainly you want it to be accessible. You want it to be relatable. You don't want to sound stiff and awkward on the page, but it's not exactly the same thing. Words flow on a page differently. I think the way that you handle a 30-minute talk into an auditorium is different than the way you write a chapter in a book. And, with a book, I've heard this comparison from a mentor of mine who's a great speaker, communicator, and a thoughtful writer. But he just said the difference between a book and a talk is that in a talk, people are stuck there for 30 minutes and you've got them. With a book, the goal is just get them to turn one more page, one more page, one more page. And it's a game that you have to play. It's a skill you have to cultivate. And so I would say maybe just to synthesize, it's like in a book, the demand or the urgency to really hook readers and keep them with you, because they have many other options. They can close the book, they can check their phone, they can turn on Netflix. They have to choose to read you. You've got to learn the art of keeping them with you and rooting them in really authentic ways and reminding them, hey, this is for you. And you're going to get something out of this. So yeah, those are a few thoughts.
That's really good. And I actually, as you mentioned that rare unicorn that can speak and write, I had this big epiphany of where my granddaughter got the idea that she could play the piano when she's never really sat before it. Because I had this flash go through my mind going, oh, Tim, you're the unicorn. You could do both. That was my thought,
Yeah.
which then I thought, well, that's pretty delusional. I'm trying to be self-aware at the same time I'm being delusional. I'm like, well, no, you're not. That's not the case. But
Yeah.
Anyway, that's really good. And I'm glad I asked that question. I want to follow it up with something that kind of nags at me at times. And I don't know where I fit into it. I think I'm stepping into it a little bit more, but how do you define the difference between someone who's a writer? They just love putting words on paper, digital, or whatever. An author, someone who just loves cranking out books. And then maybe a storyteller that might have some of both. And I might even be missing some terms, but I see those used interchangeably in this industry. And at times I wonder where I fit. So
Hmm.
what, and say whatever you want to about those, because I'm guessing you see some of all of those.
Yeah, that's a fascinating distinction. And so, as my friend Andy Crouch says, I have ideas, but maybe not many thoughts, well formed. To me, an author, there's an undertone there of it's a career, um, and it's something you do vocationally. It doesn't have to be your sole income, but you know, maybe every couple years you're putting out a book or something like that. Um, Writer is a term I think you even said, Tim, maybe before we hit record, like I've written and I have all these ideas, but I don't know that I'd call myself a writer. And I would actually push back on that a little bit because what is the standard of being a writer? Do you have to be a Flannery O'Connor? Do you have to be a C.S. Lewis? Of course not. Um, when we think of writing and being a writer, I encourage people to give themselves permission. You will never be a writer by saying you're not a writer. Um, like my 5-year-old self in kindergarten writing an acrostic poem, you got to believe it, um, even before it's maybe true. Or maybe a better way of saying it is, it becomes more true the more you do it and the more you dignify what you're doing by allowing yourself to say, I am a writer. Writers, like any other art form, we're all in different stages. And if I compared myself to some of my good writer buddies, I would feel inadequate every time. But I do call myself a writer. And I encourage people to think of it in those terms. And then storyteller, that's an interesting one. Storytelling is so integral to all types of writing, fiction, nonfiction, if we're going to distinguish between writers and authors. Mm, I think to be a writer, you have to be a storyteller. There's no way around it. That is the sort of that's the language that we speak in. That's the quickest way to the heart. That's the best way to capture attention. It is the way to teach a truth in a way that is enjoyable and engaging and delightful. And so, yeah, are there storytellers that aren't writers? Sure, of course. People choose different mediums, right? You have some who they love podcasting, telling stories that way, or telling stories through film or songwriting. I think just the good old fashioned circling up and telling stories. My friend group in college did this. We had storytelling nights, and sometimes there'd be a theme, and we would just gather, and we try to bring our best work and tell stories to one another. Uh, I love that, but yeah, I think as a writer, storytelling is part of the bread and butter of what we're doing.
The reason it sort of resonates with me, Will, is I find myself working on a lot of stories.
Yeah.
I do have nonfiction things that I'm working on, some things I want to get across. But what I will often find is I'm looking for a fictional way to bring the point across of what I'm also working on in the nonfiction space, which
Yeah.
then leads me to believe it's like maybe I'm just wired. Maybe that's what God called me to do, to go back to our earlier conversation.
Yeah.
But I do enjoy that, which then this actually brings up my, it's not a trick question, but boy, it's one that's front and center.
Mm.
Is AI cheating? Is
Mm.
AI messing up the world that we're in, or is it enhancing it and fleshing out a lot of things? I could argue both ways, and I could tell you that I'm knee deep or maybe neck deep into AI with doing a lot of things with my work and all that. And I'm doing some with my writing. So be gentle if you're going to tell me I'm cheating on that. But is it cheating?
That's funny. I was on a podcast earlier this morning, and this same question was asked. I am what I would call AI agnostic or AI cautious. And I've heard arguments, even this week, I was listening to a couple debates between people. Uh, I think it was the New York Times was predicting some almost apocalyptic catastrophes that AI is going to unleash on the world. And these are not conspiracy theory folks. These are, reasonable, very intelligent people talking about these things. But I think, so first of all, those that are AI cautious, there's no avoiding AI in the world at large. It's so competitive. Companies basically have the choice between incorporating AI or being left behind, and maybe even going out of business. I don't know. So I just heard Logos Software, they have a new AI search feature, so we're talking even ministry aimed companies. Everyone's doing it. I don't think in our world you'll be able to avoid it. If you use an app or if you search something, it's just going to be coded in and you may not even realize it. So we don't have necessarily total autonomy and choice in every area. But when it comes to our creative work and our writing, we absolutely do have a choice. So for me, I'm still processing this. I can speak from the publishing side. Our authors are not allowed to write their content using AI. Our contract specifies that they can use AI to ideate, to come up with ideas, but if any sentences are created with an LLM, they have to be rewritten in an author's own words. That's our hard and fast stance. We want the author's thoughts. If you think of all of human history up until 3 years ago, AI did not exist. And look at the beautiful things that humans have created, the words that they have written. We don't want to disrupt that. The hard thing is, for most of us, AI can write faster and better than what we could produce on our own. Some say, sweet, let's do it. That sounds great. The problem with that is, and with any piece of technology, when you start to give yourself those shortcuts, your critical thinking starts to atrophy. It's in the pain and the toil and the waiting and the frustration and the dead ends of the creative process where you got to go for a walk or you have to sleep on an idea or you have to let things marinate. That's what's at stake. Those beautiful sentences and ideas that are the overflow of that pain and that inconvenience. And so AI is like microwaving ideas. You can pop them out quickly and they're warm and they're ready to eat and serve up. But there will be some of us, and this is where I'd put myself, that I'm trying to protect my capacity for creativity, understanding that the more I take the shortcut, the more when I hit a roadblock, I'm going to turn to it again and again and again. And I'm going to slowly erode my capacity for deep thinking and for creative patience or creative tenacity and resilience. And I never want to be that person. So I do use in a few ways, even in my job. I'm still evaluating whether I want to. And when it comes to writing, I don't use it at all. I stay away from it. So that's my personal stance.
I've used it. It's a great brainstorming partner for some things that I am working on. I did an experiment when the Grok, the one with, X, came out.
Yeah.
I had some ideas and I jumped on it. This is kind of my way of testing it. I had some ideas about some stories that were leading up. They were fictional stories, but they were based in scripture. Fictional stories that were leading up to the fall of the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. And when I started, I went down a rabbit hole, and 2.5 hours later, I had a mini novel.
Wow.
That I'll be blunt, it was a pretty good story. And it kind of messed with me, Will, because I talked to my wife later, some others. I said, I'm trying to determine if this was my story. I feel very confident it was, because I was arguing. I'm going, no, that's not what happened. This is the scripture. And, I went through all this stuff, but yet I didn't write any of the words. And I do consider it for a writing assistant with a lot of things I do in business. I've just cranked out job descriptions for an entire organization in no time with some input. So I think it's going to be one of the big challenges that we have to deal with in the near future. Now, because you deal primarily with Christians, I
Yeah.
think that adds another layer.
Yes.
We had this discussion with the Christian podcasters group, and we were talking about taking podcast and using AI to transcribe and create some things from the podcast. And you would have thought I said Jesus didn't go to the cross and die for our sins. I
Yeah.
mean, it was like that's the devil and all that. Any comments on it from not just a practical writing, but from a faith standpoint?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think what I was saying earlier about our creative capacity, um, that's something to think deeply about, because the words that we use are responsible for and we're held accountable for. So there's that side of it, and just wanting to steward our words well in a way that glorifies God and does good for others. I think we need to be patient with one another, um, because this is coming so fast, and faster arguably than maybe any other technology in our lifetime. And so I don't know. I describe myself as agnostic because I'm not even sure I can comprehend the full implications of this question. I have one colleague who said AI is not a moral issue any more than the internet is an issue. It's how you use the tool. It's not the morality of the tool itself. And I'm like, okay, I can see that. At the same time, the problem is hasty adoption and mindless acceptance of something. And because it's coming so fast, we don't even have a choice in the matter. So I just encourage people to be patient. As I've listened to AI debates, I'll be honest, they just mess me up. They give me crazy cognitive dissonance. And I'm just like, I don't even know what to think about this. And so I start with what I do know and what I feel called to. And for me, that is anything that I'm sending out as my writing. I want to know that I wrote it, that I struggled, and I'm actually willing to put out something that's mediocre compared to what AI could do if it's mine, because I want to see my growth, as I was saying earlier. I want to be able to look back and see that. I want to push my mind and explore the full capacity that God has given me. So yeah, as we have these conversations, I would just say walk slowly, form conclusions slowly, listen deeply and with charity, and also, first and foremost, listen to God's Spirit whispering to you and pay attention to the convictions of your heart. Um, I'm imagining, because of how AI has taken over the world, to be dogmatic about this one way or the other is at a certain point just going to be divisive. And, it's kind of like social media. I have strong opinions about it, but ultimately I can have good conversations with others about it, but I have to let them, before God and others, make the decision that they feel right about. So I hope that's not too diplomatic of an answer, but I truly feel like I'm just immersed in this debate right now and trying to find my way.
I don't think we're going to be able to get away from it either, Will. One of the things I've asked myself, I've really reflected on some things I've worked on, because my novel I wrote, 70,000 words, these two fingers typed out every bit of it.
Mm-hmm.
And it was excruciating, and it was joyful, and it was challenging, and all of those things.
Yeah.
But then to sit down and in 2.5 hours, and I do wonder if it might be the difference between someone who considers themselves a storyteller versus someone who puts a lot of words on paper. And that's something that I'm kind of wrestling with. Will, we're running up against our time, but there's two more questions that I've got. And the first one is, I know we've got some people, probably because of the title and the topic, that are interested in putting a book out.
Yeah.
Fascinating. I heard years ago that like 87% of all people think they've got a book in them, which fascinates me, because I think there's only like 49% of the people that actually read books. So that means there's a disconnect between people that read and people. Anyway, that's a whole nother thing.
Point.
But what I think people get confused, or they don't understand, and this might be a short answer for a long topic. How does the money work with with when we move into a publishing type situation. Self-publishing, you just work on it, get it good, pop it up on Amazon or whatever.
Yeah.
But how does the money work within a publishing world? And then I'm going to ask you to tell people how they can connect with you. And then I've got one more exclamation point question I want to ask.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, for someone who doesn't know how publishing works, you really make money writing in two ways. The first is your advance. So that's an amount of money that a publisher agrees to pay you for your book. And you get that money no matter what. It's usually paid out in several installments at different stages of the writing and publishing process. And then secondly, if your books sell, and that's a big if, because most books do not earn out their advance, then you get royalties as well. So essentially, you make the publisher that money back that they paid you. If you sell additional copies, then you get a certain percentage of sales, and the percentage increases the more that you sell. So what's great about publishing for writers? Well, first, the challenge is it's hard to land a book deal because, as you said, Tim, so many people want to write, so it's highly competitive. But if you do land a book deal, unlike how the record industry used to work, maybe it still does, but where a band would sign a deal and then they would be responsible for, if they didn't make back the money, they were on the hook to pay it back. That is not how publishing works at all. The author gets the money, the publisher takes the hit no matter what. And another aspect of how the money works internally is I may have the percentages a little off, but it's something like 20% of our books pay for 80% of our budget. So most books don't work financially speaking. And so when writers get angry with publishers, like, they're just about the money, we actually lose money on 80% of the authors we take risks on. And it's the few that float the many. So kind of fascinating side peek there.
Yeah, that's good. One thing, why don't you go and tell people, like, let's just say someone's listening in, they go, you know what? I need to connect with Will. I actually think your newsletter might be the best spot to go.
Mm-hmm.
But go ahead and this is like promo time. Tell everybody where to find you. I've got one more comment and a question, then we'll be done.
Sounds
so
good.
Where do they go?
Yeah, it's very simple. It's just writercircle.co, so writercircle.co. And that's where you can sign up for my newsletter. And my goal with the newsletter is, because as an editor, I meet so many writers who are looking for their next step, or they want to know how publishing works and they want to grow as a writer. And so every Saturday I send out a tip on writing or publishing that can be read in 5 minutes. And I'm just taking all my learnings from my job, the best, practices that I see, and I just try to pour those into my newsletter in a really bite-sized way. And then I also have a podcast also called The Writer's Circle, where I interview well-known Christian authors. I interview other editors like myself, literary agents, like basically giving you a behind-the-scenes look at what it takes to write well and get published and all of that. So both of those resources are at writercircle.co.
That's great. We'll include the links down below on YouTube and also on the podcast so people can connect. Will, I know you specifically work with Christians. We talked a good bit about it, faith, but
yeah,
I'd like, just 20, 30 seconds, quick tip. Final thing here, quick tip that you've got for someone who's listening in. They go, you know what? I'm a person of faith. I think I'd like to put a book together, or I think I've got one, or something like that. Just whatever the Holy Spirit puts on your heart. What's a quick tip you want to leave us with before I wrap us up?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I would probably say this. Before you can run a marathon, you should run a 5K. And a book is a huge undertaking. Not to say that those of you listening aren't up for that challenge, but my question would be, have you written an article? Have you started a Substack or a blog or a newsletter? Have you practiced the short form of what you want to do long form? A lot of people hit this dead end as they're trying to write a book, and maybe they even get 20, 30,000 words down, which is incredible, but then they fizzle out. And so if you've got a topic that is burning, inside of your heart and mind, I would say write a couple short pieces and email that to a close circle of family and friends and start a conversation and get some feedback. And that's going to build a number of muscles, not just your writing muscle and help you improve in your craft, but it's going to help you get used to that risky feeling of putting your words out there. Um, to have your bubble burst a couple times when people push back or don't read what you've written. And what happens sometimes is we romanticize the idea of writing a book or the book, and this ultimate goal that we're so transfixed by. Um, and most people never get there when they try to run the marathon, going from 0 to 100. So yeah, it's about getting some littler wins under your belt and not despising those little wins, but seeing them as your training and as a joy. A lot of people want a book, but they don't actually like writing, and they haven't quite realized that yet. Writing short form stuff, I'm talking 1,000 words or less. That's going to help you discover if you actually love it enough to keep doing it. And so a book cannot create a love for writing, but a love for writing can create a book.
That is so good. Will Parker Anderson, man, I enjoyed this conversation. I knew that I would. Make sure you go check out writerscircle.io. I've got it pulled up here on my computer. And one of the funny things before I close this out here, I actually sometimes will take someone's bio and use AI to get some questions. I rarely get to them, but there was one that I was looking at here that I wanted to. I'm just going to mention it. We're not going to answer it, and we're going to close out. This was a question that AI generated. If Jesus were launching a writing ministry today, what do you imagine his submission letter to a major publisher might look like?
Wow. I'm
Oh,
glad
my
we're signing
goodness.
off, so I don't have to answer that one.
Oh, my goodness. We are done with that. So, Will Parker Anderson, thank you for joining us. This has been a great conversation. It has been helpful for me. I know, listeners, it's been helpful for you. Just learning more about insights about the writing industry and what's going on. It's been a real blessing. I appreciate you, Will, for sharing with us. We are Seek, Go, Create. We've got new episodes here every Monday. We're on YouTube, growing fast over there, podcast channels, all of those things. Keep doing all that you're doing because we are getting the word out with these long conversations with great people like Will. So thanks for listening in. We will see everyone next week.